The shadows of twilight danced across the wooden porch as Grace Wilson stared out at the horizon, the letter clutched in her trembling hands growing damp with tears. The Union Army regretted to inform her that Lieutenant James Wilson was presumed dead after the Battle of Gettysburg. His body never recovered among the thousands who had fallen. As the last light of day disappeared behind the rolling hills of eastern Colorado Territory, Grace felt her world collapse into darkness. April 1864 had come to Colfax, Colorado Territory, bringing spring flowers and bitter news. The small mining settlement, nestled between mountains and plains, had sent many men to war, but few had returned. At 24, Grace found herself among the growing number of war widows trying to maintain homes and livelihoods with only memories for company. The modest ranch house James had built with his own hands before marching off to war now felt cavernous and empty. The 40 acres of land they'd staked their future on stretched out before her, overwhelming in its demands. The cattle needed tending, the garden required planting, and the roof leaked in 3 places. Grace had been managing alone for nearly 3 years, but the finality of the letter made every task seem insurmountable. "I won't sell," she whispered to herself, the words becoming a mantra as she rocked gently on the porch swing. "I promised him I wouldn't sell." The following morning dawned clear and crisp. Grace had barely slept, but duty called. The remaining cattle, a meager 12 head after she'd sold most to keep the taxes paid, needed water. The creek that ran through the eastern portion of her property had been dammed up again, likely by the Chandler brothers whose larger ranch bordered hers to the north. She pulled on her work boots and grabbed the old rifle James had left behind. She didn't expect trouble, but a woman alone couldn't be too careful in these parts. The walk to the creek took nearly 20 minutes, and with each step, Grace's anger grew, displacing some of her grief. The Chandlers had been trying to force her off her land since James left, certain she couldn't manage alone. When she arrived at the creek, she found not only a crude dam of rocks and branches, but a man dismantling it, knee-deep in the water. He worked methodically, tossing the debris to the banks, unaware of her presence. His broad shoulders moved beneath a faded blue shirt, and his hat, a weathered Stetson, shaded his face from view. Grace raised the rifle, not aiming it directly at him but keeping it ready. "That's my water you're messing with, mister." The man turned slowly, hands rising slightly in a non-threatening gesture. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 28 or 29, with a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. His eyes, startlingly blue, assessed her calmly. "Madam, I'm clearing your dam, not building one," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Found it this morning while riding the boundary line. Figured it wasn't your doing." Grace lowered the rifle slightly but maintained her grip. "And who might you be to concern yourself with my property?" "Kieran Kane," he replied, stepping out of the water onto the bank. "Just signed on with Marshal Thompson over at the Lazy T. He mentioned some neighbors having trouble with the Chandlers, so I've been keeping an eye out." "Thompson sent you to spy on me?" Grace asked, her tone sharp. Kieran shook his head, water droplets flying from the brim of his hat. "No, madam. Thompson asked me to ride the boundaries, make sure the Chandlers aren't pushing beyond their limits. Finding this dam was just happenstance." Grace studied him, noting the gun at his hip and the way he carried himself, confident but not threatening. There was something in his bearing that spoke of military experience, though he wore no uniform now. "Well, Mr. Kane, I appreciate the assistance, but I can manage my own affairs." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Never doubted that for a second, considering you're the one holding the rifle." He gestured to the now flowing creek. "Water's running again. Should reach your cattle in about an hour." Grace nodded stiffly. "Thank you." As Kieran retrieved his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding grazing nearby, Grace noticed a long scar running down his left forearm, disappearing beneath his rolled sleeve. He caught her looking and unconsciously tugged the sleeve down. "War?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Bull Run," he answered simply. "First one. You had someone there too, my husband, James. Though he made it through that one." She swallowed hard. "Gettysburg took him." Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. No platitudes or empty sympathies, just quiet acknowledgement of shared pain. It was refreshing after months of pitying looks from townsfolk. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Wilson." "You know my name," she observed. "Small town," he replied with a shrug, "and Thompson mentioned you. Said you're the most stubborn woman in the territory, refusing to sell despite the Chandlers' best efforts." For the first time in days, Grace felt a smile tug at her lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." "As it was intended," Kieran replied, mounting his horse with fluid grace. "I'll continue my rounds, but I'll keep an eye out for more Chandler mischief near your property." "Good day, Mrs. Wilson." Grace watched him ride away, his straight back and easy seat in the saddle further confirming her suspicion of his cavalry background. She lowered her rifle completely, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. It had been months since she'd had a real conversation with anyone besides the shopkeeper in town, or the occasional passing neighbor. Over the next 2 weeks, Grace spotted Kieran Kane several times, always at a distance, riding the boundary between the Wilson and Chandler properties. He would tip his hat when he saw her but didn't approach. There was something comforting about his presence, though Grace was reluctant to admit it. The third Saturday in April brought the monthly supply wagon to Colfax. Grace hitched her horse to the buckboard and made the 7-mile journey into town, her list of necessities clutched tightly in her hand. She had eggs and butter to trade, and with luck, the extra would get her the nails she needed to repair the roof before the spring rains came in earnest. Colfax was hardly more than a wide spot in the road: a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. The journey took her past the Lazy Tea Ranch, and she noted several men breaking horses in the corral. She didn't see Kieran among them. The general store was crowded with ranchers and their wives, all eager for supplies and news. Grace waited patiently, listening to snippets of conversation. The war was going badly for the Confederacy, with Union forces pushing deeper into the South. Gold had been discovered up near Central City, drawing more prospectors to the territory. The stagecoach had been robbed again near La Porte. Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Holloway, the storekeeper, greeted her when her turn came. "Good to see you. Got your usual?" "Yes, please," Grace replied, handing over her list. "And if you have any roofing nails, I'd appreciate a pound." As Holloway gathered her supplies, the door opened, bringing with it a gust of wind and Kieran Kane. He nodded politely to those present, his eyes meeting Grace's briefly before he approached the counter. "Afternoon, Holloway," he said. "Marshal Thompson sent me for supplies." He handed over a separate list. "Be with you in a moment, Kane," Holloway replied, finishing with Grace's order. "That'll be $3.42, Mrs. Wilson. Your eggs and butter cover $1.20. Grace reached for her small purse, counting out the remainder. She was aware of Kieran standing nearby, not intruding but present nonetheless. As she gathered her purchases, one of the bags split, spilling flour across the wooden floor. "Let me help," Kieran said, kneeling to retrieve the scattered items. "Thank you," Grace murmured, embarrassed by the incident and the attention it drew. Outside, Kieran carried her supplies to the buckboard, placing them carefully in the back. Need help with anything else while you're in town? Grace hesitated. The roof still needed fixing, and her limited carpentry skills weren't up to the task. Pride warred with practicality. Actually, she said finally, I could use some help with my roof. It's leaking something terrible, and with the spring rains coming. Kieran nodded. I can take a look. Thompson gives us Sundays off unless there's an emergency. I could ride over tomorrow after church if that suits. That would be fine, Grace replied, surprised at her own acceptance of his offer. I can provide a meal in exchange for the work. No need, he said, a genuine smile warming his features. But I won't turn down a home-cooked meal. Been eating trail food and Thompson's wife's cooking for too long. The thought of preparing a proper meal for someone besides herself filled Grace with an unexpected anticipation. Around noon, then. I'll be there. The following day, Grace rose earlier than usual, sweeping the small house thoroughly and putting on a stew to simmer. She even changed from her work dress to her second-best dress, a simple blue calico that James had always said matched her eyes. The realization that she'd done so made her pause, guilt washing over her. James had been gone less than 3 years, officially declared dead for less than a month, and here she was, caring about her appearance for another man. It's just being polite, she told herself firmly, tucking a stray strand of auburn hair back into her bun. Kieran arrived precisely at noon, his horse loaded with tools and lumber. He'd changed from his working clothes into clean trousers and a pressed shirt, though he still wore the same weathered hat. Hope I'm not too early, he called as he dismounted. Right on time, Grace replied, stepping onto the porch. The roof's worst over the kitchen and the spare room. Kieran nodded, assessing the structure. Looks like the shingles have warped. I brought enough material to replace the worst sections. For the next few hours, Grace listened to the rhythmic sound of hammering as Kieran worked on the roof. She busied herself with the stew and baking bread, glancing occasionally out the window to see him moving confidently across the pitched surface. There was something soothing about having another person at the ranch, about the sounds of work being done that didn't come from her own hands. When the bread was done, she called him down for the meal. They sat at her small kitchen table, the conversation initially awkward but gradually easing into comfortable exchange. The roof should hold now, Kieran said, accepting a second helping of stew. But come fall, you might want to consider replacing more of the shingles before winter sets in. I appreciate the help, Grace replied. It's been difficult managing everything alone. Kieran studied her for a moment. How long were you and your husband married before he left? Just shy of 2 years, Grace answered, the familiar ache of loss present but somehow less sharp in Kieran's company. We met in St. Louis, married in '59, and came out here to start the ranch. James had dreams of building a cattle empire. She smiled sadly. Then the war came and he couldn't stay out of it, said it was his duty. Many felt that way, Kieran said quietly. On both sides. Grace looked up sharply. Which side did you fight for, Mr. Kane? Union cavalry, madam, like your husband, though I suspect we had different reasons. I don't have any particular love for the federal government, but I've got even less for the idea of owning other men. His honesty was refreshing. James felt similarly, Grace admitted. His family owned no slaves, but he believed in preserving the Union at all costs. A noble cause, Kieran said, one worth fighting for. But was it worth dying for? The question escaped before Grace could stop it, carrying all the bitterness of her lonely years. Kieran didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was soft. I can't say what your husband would think, Mrs. Wilson. I only know that men go to war believing in something greater than themselves, whether that belief justifies the cost. That's a question each widow and orphan has to answer in their own heart. His words struck Grace deeply. No one had spoken to her so plainly about James's death, about the purpose behind the sacrifice that had left her alone. "Why did you leave the army, Mr. Kane?" she asked, curious about this man who seemed to understand her pain without presuming to share it. "Got wounded at Fredericksburg in '62, he replied, unconsciously touching his side. "Ball took me in the ribs, shattered 3 of them. By the time I healed enough for light duty, I'd had my fill of watching good men die. Took a medical discharge and headed west." They fell silent, the shared understanding of war's cost hanging between them. After finishing the meal, Kieran returned to the roof to complete his work, and Grace washed the dishes, aware of a lightness in her heart that hadn't been there in the morning. As the sun began to set, Kieran gathered his tools, refusing Grace's offer of payment. "Consider it a neighborly gesture," he said, "though I wouldn't say no to another meal sometime." "Next Sunday," Grace suggested, surprising herself with her eagerness. "I'd like that," Kieran replied, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Perhaps I can tackle that loose fence post by the north pasture. You don't need to work for a meal, Mr. Kane." "Kieran, please," he corrected gently. "And I prefer earning my keep, Mrs. Wilson." "Grace," she offered in return, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "Grace," he repeated, his voice making her name sound like something precious. "Until next Sunday, then." As Grace watched him ride away, a strange mixture of emotions swirled within her. Guilt at the pleasure she found in his company, anticipation of seeing him again, and underneath it all, a whisper of possibility that perhaps life hadn't ended with James's death. The following weeks established a pattern. Kieran would arrive on Sunday afternoons, tackle some repair or improvement around the ranch, and share a meal with Grace. Their conversations grew longer and more personal, though both carefully avoided any hint of romantic interest. Grace learned that Kieran had grown up in Kentucky, the son of a horse breeder, and had been drifting since the war, unable to settle in one place for long. Kieran discovered Grace's love of books and began bringing her newspapers and occasional novels from his trips into Denver City. In late May, the Chandler brothers made their move. Grace awoke to the sound of cattle lowing in distress and grabbed her rifle, rushing outside in her nightgown and shawl. In the pre-dawn light, she could make out several riders cutting her small herd, driving them toward Chandler land. Without thinking, Grace fired a warning shot into the air. The riders paused and one broke away, heading directly toward her. She recognized Emmett Chandler, the younger of the brothers, his face twisted in a sneer. "You'd best go back inside, widow woman," he called as he approached. "Pretend you didn't see nothing." Grace leveled the rifle at him. "Those are my cattle, Chandler. Call your men off." Emmett laughed, the sound ugly in the quiet morning. "Or what? You'll shoot us all. There's 4 of us and one of you. Your husband ain't here to protect you anymore." "No, but I am." The voice came from behind Grace, steady and hard as iron. Kieran Kane rode up, his own rifle held casually but ready. Behind him were 3 more riders wearing the Lazy T brand. "Morning, Chandler," Kieran continued, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. "Seems you've mistaken Mrs. Wilson's cattle for your own." Emmett's face darkened. "This ain't your business, Kane." "Marshal Thompson disagrees," Kieran replied. "He takes a dim view of cattle rustling, especially when it's against a war widow." One of the Lazy T riders added, "Sheriff Jenkins is riding out from town as we speak. Thompson sent word yesterday when we spotted you boys scouting the Wilson place." Emmett hesitated, clearly calculating his options. Finally, he spat on the ground. "Keep your scrawny cows, woman." "But this ain't over." He wheeled his horse around and galloped back to his men, who quickly abandoned their efforts with the cattle. Grace lowered her rifle, her hands trembling with delayed reaction. "How did you know?" she asked Kieran as he dismounted. "Been watching the Chandlers for weeks," he explained. "They've tried this with other small ranchers. Thompson decided it was time to catch them in the act." He gestured to his companions, who had begun herding Grace's cattle back toward her pasture. "We'll get your stock secured. You might want to." "Ah." He gestured awkwardly, and Grace suddenly remembered she was standing in her yard in nothing but a nightgown and shawl. Heat flooded her face. "Thank you," she managed, backing toward the house. "I'll put on some coffee." By mid-morning, Sheriff Jenkins had taken statements from Grace and the Lazy T men, promising to have a serious word with the Chandlers. The incident had shaken Grace more than she wanted to admit. After the others left, Kieran lingered, helping her repair the cut fence where the Chandlers had gained access. "You should consider selling, you know," he said quietly as they worked side by side. Grace stiffened. "Not you too. Hear me out," Kieran continued. "Not to the Chandlers. But this is too much land for one person to manage alone. You could sell half and use the money to hire help for what you keep." "I promised James I'd keep the ranch," Grace said stubbornly. "All of it." Kieran straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "James would want you safe, Grace. The Chandlers won't stop. Men like that never do. So I should just give up. Let them win." "No," Kieran said firmly. "You should be smart. Fight battles you can win." Grace hammered a nail with more force than necessary. "I won't sell. This is my home." Kieran sighed but didn't press the issue. "Then you need better protection. A dog at minimum. And you should consider hiring a hand or two for the heavy work." "With what money?" Grace laughed bitterly. "The cattle barely cover the taxes." "There's other ways to make this land pay," Kieran suggested. "The soil in the lower pasture is good. You could grow more than just vegetables for yourself. The settlement's growing people need food." The idea took root in Grace's mind. Her mother had been an excellent gardener, and Grace had inherited her green thumb. Market gardening was hard work but required less land and initial investment than cattle. "I'll think about it," she conceded. The attempted cattle theft changed something between them. Kieran began stopping by more frequently, not just on Sundays. He would ride past on his daily rounds, checking that all was well. Sometimes he brought small gift seeds for her garden, a new book, once even a puppy from a litter born at the Lazy T. "He'll grow into a fine watchdog," Kieran said as the gangly pup explored Grace's kitchen. "But for now, he's just good company." Grace named the dog Scout and found unexpected joy in his energetic presence. The house felt less empty with his pattering feet and happy barks. And if Scout's arrival gave Kieran more reasons to visit, checking on the pup's training and growth, Grace found she didn't mind at all. June brought long days and afternoon thunderstorms. Grace expanded her garden as Kieran had suggested, planting rows of beans, peas, corn, and potatoes. She hired the blacksmith's son, a sturdy boy of 16, to help with the heavier work 3 days a week. The Chandlers kept their distance, though occasionally Grace would spot one of them watching the ranch from the ridge to the north. On the last Sunday in June, Kieran arrived with a peculiar expression, part nervousness, part determination. After helping Grace repair a chicken coop damaged in the latest storm, he seemed reluctant to leave. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in shades of orange and purple. Kieran turned his hat in his hands. "Marshall Thompson's offered me a partnership in the Lazy T." "That's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. "You deserve it." "It means I'd be staying in Colfax permanently," Kieran continued, watching her face carefully. "Setting down roots." Grace's heart quickened. "I thought you were a drifter, never staying in one place too long." "I was," he admitted. After the war, I couldn't seem to find anywhere that felt right, but lately— He paused, gathering his courage. Lately, I've been thinking that maybe home isn't a place so much as a feeling, a person. The implication hung in the air between them. Grace looked away, conflicting emotions battling within her. Part of her wanted to reach out to accept what Kieran was offering. Another part clung to James's memory, to the promise she'd made to wait for him. "I'm not asking for anything, Grace," Kieran said softly, reading her hesitation. "Just wanted you to know I'm staying, that I'll be here if you need me." "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more. Kieran left soon after, his farewell carrying a weight of things unsaid. Grace stood on her porch long after his figure disappeared down the road, Scout leaning against her legs as if offering comfort. That night, Grace dreamed of James for the first time in months. In the dream, they walked together through their ranch, the land green and prosperous as they had once imagined it would be. James looked as he had the day he left, young, strong, his eyes bright with purpose. "You've done well," James told her, his voice exactly as she remembered it. "Kept your promise." "I miss you," Grace told him, tears flowing freely. "I know," he smiled sadly. "But I'm not coming back, Grace." She woke with tears still wet on her cheeks, a strange peace settling over her. The dream remained vivid in her mind throughout the morning chores, James's words echoing in her thoughts. Had it been just her subconscious, giving her permission to move forward? Or something more? In the afternoon, a rider approached, not Kieran, but a young soldier in a dusty blue uniform. Grace's heart leaped to her throat, memories of the fateful letter flashing through her mind. "Mrs. Wilson," the soldier called, dismounting at her gate. "Yes," Grace replied cautiously, Scout standing alert at her side. "Corporal Davis, madam. I'm with the pension office in Denver City." He removed his hat respectfully. "I'm here about your husband, Lieutenant James Wilson." Grace steeled herself. "I received notification of his death months ago." "Yes, madam, but there's been a development." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a packet. "We've recovered Lieutenant Wilson's personal effects. They were held by a Confederate officer who was captured last year, but only recently processed through the prisoner exchange." With trembling hands, Grace accepted the packet. It contained James's pocket watch, a small Bible, and a bundle of letters, her letters to him. Read and reread until the paper was thin and creased. "There's also this," Corporal Davis said, handing her an envelope. "Lieutenant Wilson's last letter, never sent." The Confederate officer said he found it on the lieutenant's body. He was honorable enough to preserve it for return. Grace clutched the envelope to her chest. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. After the soldier left, Grace sat on her porch, the envelope unopened in her lap. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening, but still she sat, gathering courage to read James's final words. Finally, as twilight descended, she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. "My dearest Grace," the letter began in James's familiar hand. "If you are reading this, then I have fallen and cannot return to you as promised. I write this on the eve of what we are told will be a decisive battle, with a premonition I cannot shake." Grace read through tears as James spoke of his love for her, his pride in her strength, his regrets at leaving her to manage alone. The final paragraphs, though, brought fresh sobs. "If I do not return, my beloved, do not chain yourself to a memory. You are young with so much life ahead. I release you from our promises. Find happiness again. Know that I would want that for you above all things, not a lifetime of loneliness, but joy and companionship and love. This is my final wish, my parting gift to you. Live, Grace. Live fully." The letter was dated July 1, 1863, the day before Gettysburg. the day before James died on a Pennsylvania hillside far from home. Grace sat with the letter long into the night, Scout's head heavy on her lap, stars wheeling overhead in the vast Colorado sky. She thought of James, of their brief happiness together. She thought of Kieran Kane, of the tentative future that might be possible. And for the first time since receiving news of James's death, Grace allowed herself to imagine a life beyond grief. The following morning, Grace rode to the Lazy T Ranch, James's letter tucked safely in her pocket. She asked for Kieran and waited nervously in the ranch yard until he appeared from the stables, surprise and pleasure lighting his face when he saw her. "Grace," he greeted her, approaching with that easy stride that had become so familiar. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she said, finding strength in the certainty that had come with dawn. "I received something yesterday, something I think you should read." She handed him James's letter, watching as he read it carefully, his expression solemn. When he finished, he looked up at her, questions in his eyes but not presuming to ask them. "James is truly gone," Grace said, the words no longer carrying the crushing weight they once had. "I've known it for months, but part of me was still waiting, still holding to a promise." "And now," Kieran asked quietly, "now I think it's time to stop waiting and start living again." Grace took a deep breath. "James wanted that for me, and I find that I want it too." Kieran stepped closer, hope cautiously dawning in his face. "Grace, I don't want to replace what you had with James. I couldn't. But if you'll let me, I'd like to build something new with you." "I'd like that too," Grace whispered. Kieran's smile was like sunrise after a long night. Gently, he took her hand in his, the touch sending warmth through her body. "I can't promise it will be easy," he said. "The Chandlers are still trouble, the land is still demanding, life out here is hard." "I know all that," Grace replied, "but I think together we might find some peace in it, build something worth having." Kieran's eyes softened. "Your husband never came back from war," he said quietly. "I can't change that, but I promise you this: I'll bring you peace instead, every day that I can." The words, simple and heartfelt, unlocked something in Grace's chest. She stepped forward into Kieran's embrace, feeling his strong arms circle her waist, his heartbeat steady against her cheek. It wasn't the passionate romance of young love that she'd shared with James. This was something different, a quiet understanding, a shared knowledge of loss and survival, a careful hope for future joy. As summer ripened into fall, Grace and Kieran's relationship deepened. They took things slowly, respectful of her mourning and mindful of the gossip that swirled through the small community. Kieran continued his Sunday visits, helping with the ranch and sharing meals, but now there were gentle touches, lingering glances, and occasionally, when the moment felt right, tender kisses that left Grace breathless and wondering at the capacity of the human heart to heal and love again. In September, the Chandlers made one final attempt to drive Grace off her land. A mysterious fire broke out in her barn during a dry spell, threatening to spread to the house. It was only the quick action of Kieran and the Lazy T hands, alerted by a neighboring rancher who'd seen the smoke, that saved the structures. Though they couldn't prove the Chandlers' involvement, everyone knew who was responsible. The incident solidified Kieran's protective instincts. "Marry me," he proposed as they surveyed the charred remains of the barn. "Not just because of this," he added hastily. "Because I love you, because I want to build a life with you, because I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night." Grace studied his face, seeing the sincerity there, the steady devotion that had become her anchor in the turbulent months since James's death. "Yes," she answered simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." They wed in October 1864, A simple ceremony in the Colfax church with Marshal Thompson standing as Kieran's best man and the storekeeper's wife attending grace. Scout lay obediently at their feet during the vows, now a half-grown dog with massive paws that promised significant size in his future. After the ceremony, they rode back to Grace's ranch, their ranch now, to begin their life together. As they approached the house, Grace noticed something different. On the porch stood a new swing, larger and sturdier than the old one, with room for two to sit comfortably side by side. "When did you do this?" she asked, touched by the thoughtful gesture. Kieran helped her down from her horse. "Yesterday. Thought we might like a place to watch the sunset together." He looked slightly embarrassed. "Is it all right? I should have asked before changing anything." Grace squeezed his hand. "It's perfect. This is your home now, too." That evening they sat together on the new swing, watching as the sun sank behind the mountains. Grace leaned against Kieran's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist, Scout dozing at their feet. The grief for James would never completely vanish. It had become part of her, a quiet shadow that occasionally fell across her path, but it no longer defined her days. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That James was right," Grace replied honestly. "About living again, about finding happiness." Kieran's arm tightened slightly around her. "I wish I could have known him, thanked him for loving you first, for making you the woman you are." The words brought tears to Grace's eyes, but they were gentle tears, not the racking sobs of earlier grief. "He would have liked you," she said, certain of it. "Not right away, mind you. He'd have been suspicious at first." Kieran chuckled. "Naturally. I'd expect nothing less from a man with good sense." They fell silent, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The future stretched before them, uncertain as all futures are, but full of possibility. The ranch would prosper or fail. They might have children or remain childless. The Chandlers might cause more trouble or finally accept defeat. War and peace, joy and sorrow, would continue their eternal dance across the nation and their own lives. But in that moment, sitting together on their porch as twilight deepened into night, they had found what both had been seeking since the war tore apart their earlier lives: not just love, but peace. The peace that comes from belonging somewhere with someone. The peace of building something meaningful together. The peace of hearts that had known sorrow and chosen joy anyway. "I love you, Kieran Kane," Grace whispered, turning her face up to his. "And I love you, Grace Kane," he replied, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and tomorrow. In the years that followed, the small ranch on the Colorado frontier transformed. With Kieran's strength added to Grace's determination, they expanded the cattle herd and maintained Grace's market garden. They built a new barn, larger and sturdier than the one lost to fire. When Marshal Thompson retired in 1867, he sold his share of the Lazy T to Kieran, who merged the operations with Grace's ranch, creating one of the most successful spreads in the county. The Chandlers eventually sold their ranch and moved further west, their attempts to intimidate the neighboring smallholders finally defeated by the community's united stand against their tactics. Sheriff Jenkins liked to say it was Grace's stubborn refusal to be driven off that had turned the tide against them. Grace and Kieran welcomed their first child in the spring of 1866, a daughter they named Julia after Kieran's mother. 2 years later, they had a son, whom they called James, honoring the man whose love and sacrifice had shaped both their lives in different ways. A second son, Michael, arrived in 1870, completing their family. On quiet evenings, Grace would sometimes share stories of her first husband with her children, keeping his memory alive without diminishing the love they had for Kieran, who listened to these tales with respectful attention. The pocket watch that had been returned with James's effects was carefully preserved, to be given to young James when he came of age, a connection to the namesake he would never meet, but whose legacy lived on in the ranch and family he had helped create. Scout grew into an enormous, gentle guardian who shepherded the Kane children with patient devotion until his peaceful passing in 1874, by which time the oldest children had already adopted a new puppy to take up his duties. In 1876, when Colorado achieved statehood, the Kanes traveled to Denver for the celebrations, proud to have been part of building the frontier territory into something permanent and thriving. Standing in the crowd with Kieran's arm around her waist and their children fidgeting excitedly beside them, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. From the depths of grief, she had found her way back to joy. From the loneliness of widowhood, she had built a family that filled her days with noise and laughter. From the uncertainty of managing alone, she had created a partnership that gave her strength and purpose. And it had begun with a simple act of kindness, a stranger clearing a dam from her creek, offering assistance without demanding anything in return. A cowboy who had promised to bring peace to replace what war had stolen from her, and who had kept that promise through years of both hardship and happiness. "What are you smiling about?" Kieran whispered in her ear as the speeches droned on before them. Grace turned her face up to his, noting the gray now threading through his dark hair, the laugh lines deepening around his eyes, evidence of their years together, of a life well lived. "Just thinking about promises kept," she replied, squeezing his hand. "And peace found." Kieran's smile, still as warm as when she'd first seen it beside her creek 12 years earlier, told her he understood exactly what she meant. They had both carried wounds from the war that had divided their nation. They had both known loss and disillusionment. But together, they had found healing, building something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past lives. As the ceremony ended, and they gathered their excited children to begin the journey home to Colfax, Grace knew with bone-deep certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, not despite the hardships and grief that had marked her path, but because of them. For they had led her here, to this moment, to this family, to this love. And in that knowledge she found the deepest peace of all,